especially John Mearsheimer, whom you all know. He is the Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor at Political Science in Chicago. He is well known for us by his publications, which were translated into many, many languages, starting out with the tragedy of great power politics in 2001, then the Israel lobby and US foreign policy, which was translated into 22 languages. He has also written many articles that have appeared, of course, in academic journals like International Security and so forth. And he was, in 2003, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. John, I have the honor to introduce you as the first speaker. You want to sit there or come here? Okay.
Do I have to hold it, sir?
I don't know. Yeah?
Yeah, just stick it there. That's great. Thanks. Everybody can hear me clearly, right? So I don't have to shout. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Peter, for inviting me. And thank you all for coming out to listen to us. The subject is to talk about the central elements of the emerging international order. I think there's a powerful sense in the land, and I think it was reflected in Peter's comments, that the tectonic plates that underpin international relations are shifting. And I think that most people don't have a really good sense of what's going on here. You have the sense that we're sort of in the dark and people are trying to figure out exactly what's happening. And what I'd like to do is give you my take on the emerging international order. But to talk about the emerging international order, you have to understand what the existing international order is. So what I want to do is spell that out for you in some detail. I think the existing international order, right, is the international liberal order. Talk about order in the system today. You're talking basically about the international liberal order that the United States, by and large, is behind. Now, I think it's very important that we understand what each of those three words mean. When we talk about order, what exactly are we saying? When we say it's liberal, what exactly are we saying? And when we say it's international, what exactly are we saying? Now, regarding my definition of order, I think it's consistent with what Peter said, although I want to put a finer point on it. Order, for me, is all about the rules. And to put it in slightly different terms, it's all about the institutions that govern, as much as you can have governability in the system, the relations among states. And as you know, especially you who are here in Europe, that the two key institutions are the EU and NATO. Those are two key institutions. Those are integral parts of the international order, the liberal international order. But those institutions are basically rules that try to guide state behavior. And of course, once you get outside of Europe, you're talking about institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, NAFTA, the United Nations. There are a whole slew of very important institutions that exist in the international system. And of course, when we begin to talk about change here, the question is what's going to happen to those institutions over time? They're going to be replaced, they're going to be altered, so forth and so on. So that's what we mean by order. When we talk about liberal, right, what we're really saying is two things. One is that that order should be dominated by liberal democracies who go out of their way to promote liberal democracy. Because the idea is that in a rule-based system, you are likely to be at your most effective when you have liberal democracies. I'm not saying that's true, but there's a widespread belief that that's true. So needless to say, the United States and its European allies go to great lengths to promote democracy. The second liberal element is that you believe in economic openness. You believe that free trade, that economic interdependence, these were all words that Peter was using, is very, very important. And all you have to do is think about the EU and NATO, and think about EU expansion and NATO expansion and promoting the Orange Revolution and the Rose Revolution. You can see exactly how this plays itself out in the real world, right? What about the word international? The idea here is, and I'll say more about this as we go along, that this order should encompass the entire planet. The name of the game is to get as many states as possible incorporated into these institutions. And the more states that you have in these institutions, and the more that they adhere to the rules of the system, the better off we all will be. Right? That's the basic set of principles that underpin the existing international liberal order. Now, the question is, what shapes that order? What really drives an order? Two things. One, most importantly, and this is exactly what you would expect from a good realpolitiker like me, is the balance of power. The most powerful states in the system write the rules. As you all know, the United States loves to write the rules. This makes the Chinese and the Russians very unhappy. They'd like to write the rules. Who wouldn't want to write the rules? So the question then becomes, who writes them? And it's, again, the most powerful state or states. If you live in a bipolar system, there are two states who can write the rules. If you live in a unipolar system, there's only one state. But if you're in a multipolar system, there are a number of states who are going to want to write the rules. So the balance of power matters. And furthermore, if you're in a multipolar system, or even a bipolar system, the question is, how powerful are those great powers relative to each other? And if you have a multipolar system that has one gorilla in it, one really powerful state, it's going to do a lot more to write the rules. So the first thing you want to ask yourself is, what does the balance of power look like? Then the second thing you want to ask yourself is, what is the political ideology of the dominant state or dominant states? And when John says we live in a world that's dominated by an international liberal order, that's because the dominant state, which is the United States of America, is a liberal state. And if it was not a liberal state, we would not have an international liberal order. So the two questions you want to ask yourself when you start thinking about those forces that underpin and shape the international order is, number one, what's the balance of power look like? And number two, what's the ideology of the dominant state or states? A little bit of history here. Let's go back to 1945. In 1945, you had a bipolar system. And that's when, between 1945 and 1990, the so-called international liberal order was created. But in fact, it was not an international liberal order. It was a Western liberal order, because the Soviet Union and China and a huge chunk of the planet was not part of that order. That liberal order should have been called a Western liberal order. And of course, it grew here in Western Europe, and it was linked very closely with the United States. And we can see links in Asia as well, in places like Japan and Korea and so forth and so on. So you had a bipolar world. And inside the West, the United States was the dominant force by far. In a funny way, it was kind of a unipolar system inside the West, right? The United States was the dominant power, and we shaped the order. And of course, the Europeans went along willingly. They loved this order that we helped create. And they're its biggest defenders now, especially now that Donald Trump is the president, right? Then what happened in 1991 is we transitioned from a bipolar system to a unipolar system. And what happened is that mainly the United States, but in conjunction with the Europeans, decided that what we would do is make that Western liberal order an international liberal order. That's what NATO expansion is all about. That's why you Europeans have been working with us to fight wars and spread democracy all over the world. Because what you want to do is make that Western liberal order an international liberal order. Right? And actually, it looked like things were going pretty well up until the Ukraine crisis in February 2014. But it's very important to see here, and I'll talk more about this in a second, that when you have a dominant power, which is what you had in the West during the Cold War, and what you had on the planet since the Cold War ended, that's the unipolar moment, that dominant power is the United States. It's quite easy to build effective institutions because that dominant power can shape the rules and everybody else kind of follows them. And that's especially true of that dominant power is a liberal power, because liberalism is quite easy to sell. So that's what was going on between 1945 and 1990, and then from 91 up until the present, right? And you see that what changed in 1990 was the end of the Cold War and a shift in the balance of power. But the state that was running the system was still the United States, which was a liberal power. That brings us to the present. I think what's happening here is we are moving into, if we're not already there, and I would argue we're already there, we're in a multipolar system, right? So you see, you went from bipolarity, where the West mattered for creating this system, to unipolarity, where we tried to spread it all over the globe, to multipolarity. And the key player here, of course, in this new world is China, and Peter was alluding to that as well. China is rising, and given the size of the population in China, and given its economic potential, this could be a behemoth like the United States has never seen before. This could be a really very powerful country. And all our experience tells us, and our theories tell us, that when you get a fundamental change in the distribution of power, right, that's what underpins this liberal international order. You're going to get some change. And furthermore, there's no evidence that China is a liberal power, right? It's not even clear the United States is a liberal power anymore with Donald Trump in charge. Remember what I said, what a liberal power is interested in doing is spreading democracy, one, and two, economic openness. You've all noticed that Donald Trump is not especially interested in spreading democracy, right? And number two, he is a protectionist at heart, right? But let's just assume the United States remains a liberal country. The fact is, if China continues to rise, China's going to want to alter the order, and it's already doing that. And it will alter the order in two ways. Number one is it will try to rewrite the rules inside the existing system. And by the way, I don't blame them one bit. They don't like the rules that exist because they know Uncle Sam wrote those rules. And they know Uncle Sam wrote those rules to satisfy Uncle Sam's best interests. And the Chinese want to rewrite the rules for their own selfish purposes. That's the way international politics works. And furthermore, they're going to create new institutions. You can already see them coming. The AIIB. They have a lot of money, those Chinese, and they're going to create institutions that have a lot of influence. That's a change in the order. A very important change in the order. All of this is a way of saying, if China continues to rise, the international order that we all knew since the Cold War ended, and that those of us from the West knew since the end of World War II, is going to undergo some profound change. If China does not grow, the liberal international order is going to remain intact. It's very important to understand that there's only one country on the planet that can give the United States a run for its money over time, and that's China. There are three principal adversaries from the 20th century. When I say our, I mean the United States. There are three principal adversaries from the 20th century: Germany, Japan, and Russia. They're all depopulating, right? The gap between us and them is going to widen over time. There's no other country besides China that can give us a run for our money. India is not going to give us a run for our money. Our population will continue to increase, mainly because we import huge numbers of people, and we're really good at generating wealth, despite all our craziness, okay? So the United States will continue to run the system, and this liberal international order will remain intact if China does not grow. If China grows, it is going to be a fundamentally different world in terms of that international order. Because again, China doesn't like the existing order, and it's going to try and rewrite the rules. And again, China is not a liberal democracy. Let me conclude by saying a few words on what I think the implications are for Europe. First of all, you are part of this broader liberal international order. NATO and the EU may be Eurocentric institutions, but they operate in a highly interdependent world. Again, Peter's rhetoric was getting at this very nicely. So it's not like you live in isolation. So as the greater order begins to change, that's going to have an effect on you. It's inevitable. Second point, the United States is going to pivot to Asia in a big way if China continues to grow. I wouldn't be surprised if we leave Europe completely, because there's no reason for us to stay in Europe. There's no great power on the horizon in Europe that necessitates us staying here. China is a potential peer competitor, and the United States will eventually put its gun sights on China in a big way. The United States does not like potential peer competitors. You know what we did to Imperial Germany, you know what we did to Imperial Japan, you know what we did to Nazi Germany, and you know what we did to the Soviet Union. We helped flush all four of them down the toilet bowl. We do not like potential peer competitors. So as China rises, you can rest assured the United States will shift its focus to China in really big ways, to East Asia. And this is what the pivot that Hillary Clinton announced as Secretary of State in 2011 was all about, okay? That then raises the question for Europe, what will be the effect of a weakening of NATO? And I would argue that the European Union, the EU, which is very much an economic institution, is built on a foundation of security that is provided by NATO. The EU needs NATO. The EU needs the United States. And of course, NATO is really all about keeping the United States in Europe. So if the United States, because of this shift in the balance of power, begins to move towards Asia, if I'm correct that there's a serious pivot, right, and I think you can already see this beginning to happen with Trump when he argues that NATO is obsolete, right? If that happens, that foundation of security that underpins the European Union is going to evaporate. And that is going to cause huge problems for the European Union. Because again, that order that exists is built on a balance of power. Security is always underpinning economic institutions of any sort. Then we have the question, what does the balance of power in Europe look like without the United States? Let's assume the United States basically exits Europe. What does it look like here? You're going to have a multipolar system in Europe. And the problem with multipolar systems is you don't have a dominant state that can write the rules. Germany looks really powerful now. But Germany's going to get weaker relative to its neighbors over time because Germany's depopulating and France and Britain are not. Germany now has many millions more people than both Britain and France. UN demographic projections say that by the year 2050, Germany will be roughly the same size as Britain and France. It's going to be a multipolar system. And in a multipolar system, it's very hard for any one power to impose order, to write the rules. You therefore have all sorts of collective action problems. So not only are you going to be taking away the security foundation with the crumbling of NATO, right? Number two, you're going to have a roughly multipolar system in Europe that is going to cause all sorts of problems for purpose of writing the rules. And the final point I would make is that there's a very powerful tension in international politics, especially in the West, between nationalism and liberalism. And if you read the newspapers and you read academic articles these days, everybody's talking about the resurgence of nationalism. Nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. It never disappeared. We pretended it did, especially here in Western Europe. We didn't have to pretend in the United States because we never talk about nationalism in the United States. We always talk about liberalism this, liberalism that, and the elites love liberalism, right? And we're all part of this international liberal order. But you want to understand that underpinning all of these nation states is nationalism. Nationalism is a very powerful force, and it's beginning to rear its head. And what we're talking about here is a system that is going, we're talking about a system and international order that is likely to become increasingly less liberal over time, mainly because of the rise of China, but also because the Russians will be big players in Europe, and the Russians are not liberals, and the Americans, certainly under Donald Trump, are not looking very liberal. And you're going to see more and more nationalism come to the fore. And that's going to cause all sorts of problems here in Europe. Nationalism, the absence of the United States and NATO and the security umbrella, and number three, the fact that you'll have a multipolar Europe. So my basic bottom line is that if China continues to rise, the world is going to change in fundamental ways. If China does not continue to rise, if its growth plateaus or goes down over time, the existing order will remain largely intact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
I think you have given us enough food for thought. And the question which I only wanted to ask you, if the United States is going to leave Europe, will the United States in their pivot towards Asia, then be successful or being reduced to a regional power? No, don't answer, please. Okay. We leave it for the discussion later on. Okay, thank you.